Hello, welcome to Week 12, Sociology of Crime. My name is William Wood, and this is your very last lecture for the term, so I bet most of you are quite happy. So we'll be winding up with brief discussion, this concept of cultural criminology. I think this is something that will hopefully at least be interesting to many of you. Moving a little bit away from a lot of the underlying, or what cultural criminologists call background factors of crime, things like poverty, etc., still factor into cultural criminology. Cultural criminology wants us to ask more pointedly about this concept they call the foreground of crime, meaning why is it that crime in particular ways for particular people becomes a meaningful action? How do people take pleasure in crime, for example? Why is it that particular types of subcultures appeal to particular groups of people? Historically, but also biographically in terms of their own lives. So we can think of cultural criminology in this sense as a theoretical and methodological approach to the study of crime that looks primarily at the relationship between the emotions and experiences of those involved in criminal activity, this thing that I called the foreground, and the material and symbolic realities of control and marginalization, many of which we've already explored that you'll be familiar with around different theories of offending. So the influence of cultural criminology are broad. This comes out of, in part, the Birmingham School, the development of a cultural studies analysis or approach called reception analysis. Here, Proctor summarizes the theoretical assumptions of Stuart Hall's work. He notes Hall's work, thus, meaning is not simply fixed or determined by the sender. 2, the message is never transparent. And 3, the audience is not passive. It's not a passive recipient of meaning. So Hall's work was enormously influential in things like media studies. Much of the mid-20th century imagined audiences as extremely passive consumers of media. Right? Senders, advertisers, for example, or writers for television shows would create messages. These would be encoded, sent, broadcast over the airwaves, and then received somewhat passively for a large homogenized audience. Stuart Hall and his colleagues did a lot of empirical research. What they found was that this isn't what audiences do with messages at all. Audiences interpret them in a wide variety of ways. This depends on, in many cases, who the audience is. So audiences weren't nearly as homogeneous as previously thought, far more heterogeneous. Right? So the meaning, even if there was an intended meaning attached to the message and its encoding, was very often decoded by audience in ways that were alternative to the intentions of the senders, or even in some cases opposite. Right? So reception analysis is the beginning of a view of culture and audiences in this sense, and the creation of culture is far more than the kind of mass marketing, homogeneous, we call it Wonder Bread in the United States. All right, it's your bread that's been, bleached beyond anything other than starch. Interactionist theories. From the reading this week, Jeff Farrell notes, in examining the mediated networks and discursive connections noted above, cultural criminologists also trace the manifold interactions through which criminals, control agents, media producers, and others collectively construct the meaning of crime. In doing so, cultural criminologists attempt to elaborate on the symbolic in symbolic interactionism by highlighting the popular prevalence of mediated crime imagery, the interpersonal negotiation of style with criminal and deviant subcultures, the emergence of larger symbolic universes which crime takes on political meaning. So here again is this thing that I started with in the beginning. It's not enough for cultural criminologists to say that crime exists, but why does crime become meaningful the way that it does when it does? So one of the optional pieces you'll be reading this week is a book chapter by the sociologist Jack Katz from a very influential book he wrote in the 1980s called Seductions of Crime. This chapter, The Way is the Badass, asks some really interesting questions. For example, particularly in relationship to masculinity and crime, how does one learn to be bad? Nobody's born bad, for example. We're born babies. We're born children. we laugh, we run around, we poop our pants, and somewhere in between that and and researching these really, really, really predatory, tough street criminals, there's a phase at which some people, at least, it becomes exceedingly important for them to become bad, to be able to project this in a convincing way to others. So why that is important for some people, or even what that symbolic imagery of being bad is, this is the nature, or really this is a lot of the focus of cultural criminology. We might think of it in another sense as the phenomenology of criminal behavior or involvement in crime, as well as the meaning construction of that by media, by social control agencies, and so on. Subcultural theories, also influential. Dick Hebdige work here. Members of the working class, argued Hebdige, encounter daily hardships and alienations from ruling hegemony. So here we have, again, overlap with what we looked at with the first lecture this week on New Left Realism. Younger generations reluctant to suffer what their parents go through without protests. They developed distinct styles and practices manifest their separate identity, condition, and subversion. This research came out of the United States, right, encountering young black of Caribbean origin, which have much more historically grounded and formed reason for protest, to adapt some of their feature in order to form what Hebdige called white ethnicity. Media discovers a subculture, essentially baptizing it with a reaction that is typically a moral panic. Subculture expands while in the process losing its rebellious edge, either by turning into another commercial consumer product, or the media humanistically exoticizing its members, rendering them as harmless clowns. Now, the mainstream hegemony again can return to its peaceful, unthreatened state. All right, this is the cycle of subcultures, Hebdige argues. So if we were to look at things like punk rocks, mods, rockers, maybe early rap music, things like this, we'd see similar cycles of subculture, right? Members of the working class pushing back against the dominant normative values, media constructions, so on and so forth. But eventually the subcultures themselves being exploited and co-opted, often for commercial purposes. This concept of moral panic is one that we've mentioned, that I've alluded to earlier in the course, but I said we would wait until we get to week 12, because subcultural theories really is where this emerges out of. This comes out of Cohen's work, and it's a concept that is developed over in the 1970s, right, over 40 years ago, but is still used and exceedingly useful today, right? For example, we have, if you were to ask me personally, particularly as an immigrant to Australia, at least looking at it with a little bit of the eyes of an outsider, I think often when we go to other countries, it's easier to see their moral panics than our own. But certainly, the moral panic around things like boat people, or more recently about African gangs in Melbourne, right? Sociologists would really look at these and look at the media construction of the threat versus the reality, which suggests that, at least in short, the vast majority of young African immigrants are not engaged in this type of behavior, so on and so forth. Anyway, the larger point being the concept of moral panic is still widely used today in terms of cultural or subcultural analyses of cycles of public concern or outrage over perceived threats. So Cohen defines moral panics as a condition, episode, person or group of persons emerges to become defined as a threat to societal values and interests. Bikies are another great moral panic here, right? And which isn't to say, in a sense, that there are no underlying criminal elements within moral panics, but at some point the panic becomes larger than the reality of the threat itself, right? So Cohen certainly recognized that some subcultures can contain implicit or even explicit criminal elements, but they become larger. In some sense, they take over the public focus, right? This tends to be started by moral entrepreneurs, those in positions to label or target others who are a threat to moral or political order. We've looked a little bit at this concept when we looked at Howie Becker's work. So those who are a threat to moral or political order, Cohen called folk devils, argue that the media plays a crucial role in their process. So Cohen set forth 5 stages in the construction of a moral panic. And this is today still quite useful. It's modified in some ways, but you'd find this today. Look, as a media scholar, I regularly review articles or books or other things where people still use and apply the concept of moral panic. Someone, something, or a group are defined as a threat to social norms or community interests, right? Again, we can, we can pick out many examples from my own country today, right? My government, Trump and his administration beginning to identify immigrants as a crime problem. The vast majority of research suggests this is not the case, that first-generation immigrants tend to be equally, if not more, law-abiding than citizens of the countries they immigrate to. But in any case, something or someone or a group defined as a threat to social norms. Threat is then depicted in a simple and recognizable symbolic form by the media, really the distilling of, down into very, very basic binaries, good and evil, so the discourse here is distilled into these very, very recognizable, easily defined and able to be projected into a viewing audience. The portrayal of these symbols then rouses public concern. There's a response from authorities and policymakers. We have to do something. We need to do something. We need to act. Right, this is always the, and you often know it's a moral panic when it's that we need to do something for the kids, right? We need to keep the kids safe. And then finally, the moral panic of the issue results in social changes within the community, some type of policy response. Usually outsiders are at the very least castigated, if not subject to direct forms of social control or suppression and so on. Assumptions within cultural criminology more broadly, right, are as follows. Criminal behavior is more often than not subcultural behavior. Okay? Criminal subcultures incorporate far more than simple proximities of personal association. Right? People don't, this is saying in a sense, people don't go to gangs just because they know each other. Right? To speak of criminal subcultures is to recognize not only an association of people, but a network of symbols, meanings, and knowledge. Right? When people come into subcultures, in many ways they develop a way of living. Shared language, shared meaning, shared symbols, shared culture. It would be the same, obviously it's not subcultural, it would be the same for somebody that grows up, in a sports environment, playing footy, for example, right? Shared symbols, shared meaning. It's not simply sport for exercise, right? There's a larger meaning to it, the same way cultural criminologists argue. There's a larger meaning to involvement in subcultures other than the purported function of the subculture itself. Three, much of the subcultural meaning, action, identity, and status is generated around style, right? That is a shared aesthetic of subculture's members. Style, and this goes back to Dick Hebdige's work, style has always been a central feature, not only in terms of how a subculture presents itself, but the way in which, in some sense, it separates itself away from mainstream or normative beliefs, values, and symbols. 4, from early work within British culture studies tradition to Katz and other contemporary criminologists, research has shown that symbolism and style not only shape criminal subcultures, but intertwine with the broader social and legal relations in which these subcultures are caught. Fifth point Farrell makes, in the same way that everyday crime and criminalization operate as cultural enterprises, everyday popular cultural undertakings Though social activities organized around art, music, and fashion are regularly recast as crime. So here we see a little bit of this notion of the co-opting of subcultures. So this figure, Tupac Shakur, I don't have here by mistake. Right, in many ways, he becomes a pop icon, far more than the subcultural elements that he comes out of. This notion of social activities organized around art, music, fashion, regularly recast as crime. So even though in reality the black man is policed with a high degree of suppression and often brutality in the United States, there's an equal public fascination with crime and the projection of things like rap music, for example, obviously not only Tupac in this case, where the public fascination in many ways serves a different function or even may serve to mask the reality, the social control elements involved in policing or in social control responses to minority populations. Cultural criminology might focus on different methods, including ethnography, participant observation, and media studies. Keith Hayward notes, for example, cultural criminology is a distinct theoretical, methodological, and interventionist approach to the study of crime that places criminality and its control squarely in the context of culture. That is, it views crime and the agencies and institutions of social control as cultural products or as creative constructs, right? So they're not saying that everything is culture, that we can reduce everything to culture, but much of what we do, or certainly much of the way that we make meaning of crime, how is it in a sense that we know, and here they're not making a functionalist argument, right? We can think of Durkheim's notion of a social function of crime, as defining of moral boundaries. But rather, why is it that in some ways, or cultural criminologists ask in what ways do we know or are able to identify things like what is good, what is bad, right? These come out of the media representations of normative, right, social institutions, polices, schools, churches, etc., and deviant or subcultural associations as well. So areas of study include concepts that Farrell and his colleagues call edge work, right? So these are crimes of style. Graffiti has been a big area of study within cultural criminology. Subcultures themselves, the meaning, the symbolic representation, not only of fashion, but even in some cases, the types of crimes or the way that people do crimes. And then this notion of seductions and meaning in crime, Katz's work, which we'll be looking at for your optional reading for the week. Historically, this draws from a deeper tradition within sociology, coming out of the work of one of the sociologists that we look back all the way in week 1, Max Weber. This notion of Verstehen criminology, this term is the German for to understand, right? It's the infinitive form of to understand. And within this vein of sociology, this history of sociology, has been the focus not only to explain patterns of what people do. For example, we looked in week 2 about how crime is patterned in particular ways. But the other question in sociology, really the other half of sociology historically, has been to understand why people do what they do the way they do. Even to understand why they think or how they understand the world. This is what's meant by this concept. To understand it is a cultural process of meaning making situated within other processes of social control, marginalization, and media. So Weber has a great quote here that summarizes why it's important in the sociological tradition to focus on interpretation, right? And cultural criminology is very much an interpretive approach to the study of crime. Weber explains that why Verstehen is important for sociology when he argues, suppose that somehow an empirical statistical demonstration of the strictest sort is produced, showing that all men everywhere who have been placed in a certain situation have invariably reacted in the same way to the same extent. Right? Suppose we have, a perfect correlation of 1 is what he's saying. Suppose that whenever the situation is then experimentally reproduced, the same reaction invariably follows, which is to say, in the most literal sense of the word, the reaction is calculable. Such a demonstration, Weber argues, would not bring us a single step closer to the interpretation of this reaction. By itself, such a demonstration would contribute absolutely nothing to the project of understanding why this reaction ever occurred, and moreover, why it invariably occurs in the same way. Right? Unless we have an understanding, he argues, the interpretive aspects, the meaning attached to it by the people that are engaged in it, both individually and also collectively, we only have half of the equation. Okay, so that ends the final shorter lecture on cultural criminology. Hopefully, along with the weekly activities, you find that interesting. It's certainly one of the newer schools of thought within criminology. I find some of its arguments extremely engaging and thought-provoking, and particularly Jack Katz's work. I hope you find that useful for this week. Hopefully you've enjoyed the lectures. As I said, this is the first time I've done them, so I'm sure it's a little bit awkward for me as well. But I think it's light years ahead of what we used to do for online students in terms of just having you listen to the really crappy audio recordings. Yeah, I hope you were able to get something out of these lectures. Certainly was a learning experience for me. And I wish you all a good break over the term, and hopefully I'll see you in some other courses.